The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Samuel Crawford's weathered face as he guided his horse along the rocky trail. The year was 1882, and tensions between settlers and Apache tribes ran high throughout the territory. Samuel, a former cavalry scout turned rancher, had lived in these harsh lands long enough to read the signs that most newcomers missed. Today, something felt different. The usual sounds of desert life seemed muted, and his horse's ears kept twitching nervously. Samuel had been riding since dawn, searching for 3 of his cattle that had wandered off during the previous night's thunderstorm. His small ranch sat precariously between 2 worlds, the expanding frontier of white settlement and the ancient homeland of the Apache people. Unlike many of his neighbors, Samuel had always maintained a cautious respect for the native tribes, understanding that survival in this unforgiving landscape required wisdom rather than blind aggression. As he crested a small hill, the sound that made his blood run cold reached his ears, the unmistakable crack of gunfire echoing through the canyon below. Samuel quickly dismounted and crept forward, his rifle ready but his finger off the trigger. Peering over the edge, he witnessed a scene that would haunt him for years to come. 3 white men, clearly outlaws by their appearance and manner, had cornered 2 young Apache women near a small water source. The women, probably sisters given their similar features and age, were trying desperately to protect each other while backing toward a cluster of rocks. One appeared to be injured, blood visible on her arm, while the other stood defiantly in front of her, clutching a broken piece of wood as her only weapon. The outlaws were laughing cruelly, their intentions obviously sinister. Samuel recognized the type immediately. The worst kind of frontier scum who preyed on anyone they perceived as vulnerable. They had probably been tracking these women for some time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike when they were alone and far from their people. Samuel's mind raced as he calculated his options. 3 against 1 were not favorable odds even for an experienced fighter like himself. But the alternative, watching these women suffer or die while he did nothing, was unthinkable. His own daughter would have been about the same age as these girls before consumption took her and his wife 5 years earlier. The memory strengthened his resolve. Moving carefully to get a better position, Samuel noticed that the outlaws had grown careless in their confidence. They had left their horses loosely tethered and their rifles leaning against rocks while they advanced on foot. This gave him the element of surprise he needed. Samuel had learned from his years scouting for the army that sometimes the best strategy was the most unexpected one. Taking a deep breath, Samuel stood up and fired a shot into the air, his voice booming across the canyon as he shouted for the men to stop. The outlaws spun around in shock, scrambling for their weapons. In the confusion, Samuel managed to put a bullet through the leg of the nearest man, sending him crashing to the ground with a scream of pain. The other 2 outlaws took cover behind, the rocks returning fire wildly. Samuel used the terrain to his advantage, moving from position to position while keeping the pressure on his enemies. He had fought in situations like this during his military days, and muscle memory guided his actions even as his heart pounded with adrenaline. During the firefight, Samuel caught glimpses of the 2 Apache women. Rather than fleeing in panic, as he might have expected, they had taken shelter behind a large boulder and were watching the battle with keen intelligence. The uninjured sister was tending to her wounded sibling while keeping alert to the changing situation around them. The battle lasted nearly 20 minutes, with Samuel methodically wearing down his opponents. When the second outlaw made the mistake of exposing himself too long while trying to flank Samuel's position, a well-placed shot ended his threat permanently. The third man, seeing his companions dead or disabled, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. Samuel approached, cautiously, his rifle trained on the surviving outlaw. The man was young, probably not much older than 20, and his face was pale with terror. Samuel quickly disarmed him and used rope from one of the horses to tie him securely. The wounded outlaw was bleeding heavily, but would survive if he received proper medical attention soon. Only then did Samuel turn his attention to the Apache women. They had emerged from their hiding place and were standing together, watching him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Samuel slowly set his rifle aside and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. He had picked up enough Apache words during his scouting days to communicate basic concepts, though his pronunciation was poor. The older sister, who appeared to be about 19, stepped forward and spoke in careful English. Her voice was strong despite the ordeal she had just endured. She thanked Samuel for his intervention and explained that they were returning from gathering medicinal plants when the outlaws had surprised them near the water source. Her younger sister, perhaps 16 years old, had been shot in the arm during their initial attempt to escape. Samuel examined the younger woman's wound and determined it was not life-threatening, though it would need proper care. He tore strips from his spare shirt to create a makeshift bandage, working gently while the older sister translated his actions and reassured her sibling. Despite the language barrier, Samuel could sense the deep bond between the two women and their fierce loyalty to each other. As he worked, Samuel learned that the sisters were daughters of a respected Apache leader. They had been expected back at their village by sunset, and their absence would certainly trigger a search party. This information filled Samuel with both relief and apprehension. Relief that help was coming for the women, but apprehension about how that help might react to finding a white man at the scene. The sun was beginning to set when Samuel finished, tending to the wounded sister. He helped both women to his horse and prepared to escort them partway back toward their village. The surviving outlaw would have to be dealt with later, though Samuel doubted the man would survive long in the desert if left alone. As they traveled slowly through the gathering dusk, Samuel reflected on the day's events. He had acted on instinct, driven by a moral code that demanded he protect the innocent regardless of their race or background. But he knew that his actions might be misunderstood by both sides of the cultural divide that separated Apache and settler communities. The older sister rode behind Samuel, while her wounded sibling was carefully positioned in front of him. Despite the day's trauma, both women maintained their dignity and composure. Samuel found himself impressed by their courage and resilience in the face of such terrible danger. As full darkness approached, the distant sound of approaching horses reached their ears. The Apache search party had found them at last. The thunder of approaching hooves grew louder in the desert night as Samuel felt his muscles tense involuntarily. He had faced Apache warriors before during his cavalry days, but never in circumstances quite like these. The older sister, sensing his nervousness, spoke quietly in English to reassure him that she would explain everything to her people. Her calm confidence helped steady Samuel's nerves, though he kept his hand near his sidearm out of habit. Within minutes, a group of 12 Apache riders emerged from the darkness like shadows given form. They moved with the fluid grace of people who had lived their entire lives in harmony with this harsh landscape. Their leader, a man Samuel estimated to be in his 40s with distinctive silver streaks in his long black hair, raised his hand to halt the group about 30 yards away. The older sister called out in Apache, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. Samuel could not understand her words, but her tone conveyed both relief and urgency. She was clearly explaining the day's events and vouching for Samuel's character. The wounded younger sister also spoke, though more weakly, adding her own account of the rescue. Samuel sat perfectly still on his horse, knowing that any sudden movement could be interpreted as hostile. He had learned during his military service that Apache warriors were incredibly skilled fighters who could react with lightning speed to perceived threats. The smart play was to remain calm and let the sisters handle the initial explanations. The Apache leader listened intently to both women, asking several questions in their native tongue. His eyes never left Samuel's face during the entire exchange, and Samuel could feel the weight of that penetrating stare. This was clearly a man accustomed to making life and death decisions quickly and accurately. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, the leader spoke a few words to his companions. 2 warriors immediately rode forward, but Samuel was relieved to see they kept their weapons lowered. The older sister translated for Samuel, explaining that her father wanted to examine her wounded sibling before making any decisions about how to proceed. Samuel carefully dismounted and helped both women down from his horse. The Apache leader approached on foot, and Samuel got his first close look at the man whose daughters he had rescued. The resemblance was unmistakable. All 3 shared the same proud bearing and intelligent dark eyes. This was clearly a man of significant authority within his tribe. The father examined his wounded daughter with gentle hands that spoke of both parental love and medical knowledge. Samuel watched as the man carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandages and inspected both the wound and Samuel's treatment of it. After a thorough examination, the Apache leader looked up at Samuel and spoke several words in his own language. The older sister translated with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "My father says you have skill in treating wounds. He wants to know where you learned such things." Samuel explained briefly about his military service and the unfortunate necessity of learning field medicine during his years as a cavalry scout. This information seemed to spark additional interest from the Apache leader. He asked several more questions through his daughter's translation, inquiring about which unit Samuel had served with and where he had been stationed. Samuel answered honestly, mentioning his time at Fort Apache and his participation in several peaceful negotiations between the military and various Apache bands. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, as the Apache leader carefully evaluated Samuel's character and motivations. Samuel understood that his life might very well depend on this man's assessment of whether he could be trusted. The other warriors remained alert, but showed no signs of immediate hostility, suggesting that the initial explanations from the sisters had been favorably received. Finally, the Apache leader made what appeared to be a decision. He spoke at length to his daughter, who listened carefully before turning to Samuel with an expression of mixed relief and concern. "My father is grateful for what you have done today. You risked your life to protect his daughters when you could have simply ridden away. This is not forgotten." However, the daughter continued, there was a complication. The rescue of the sisters and the killing of the outlaws had created a situation that would require careful handling. Word of the incident would spread quickly among both Apache and white communities, and reactions might be unpredictable. Some whites might view Samuel's actions as consorting with the enemy, while some Apache might question whether the entire situation had been orchestrated somehow. Apache leader proposed a solution that caught Samuel completely off guard. He wanted Samuel to return with them to their village as a guest, where the full story could be told properly to the tribal council, and where Samuel could receive appropriate recognition for his brave actions. This would help prevent any misunderstandings or rumors from taking root in either community. Samuel hesitated, understanding the honor being offered but also aware of the potential consequences. His own community might not understand why he had spent time in an Apache village, regardless of the circumstances. There were already tensions between his ranch and some of his more hostile neighbors who viewed any contact with native peoples as suspicious. But the older sister made a compelling argument. She pointed out that Samuel's wounded cattle were probably still wandering somewhere in the area, and that Apache trackers could help locate them much more quickly than Samuel could manage alone. More importantly, she suggested that Samuel's presence in their village might help build understanding between their communities during these troubled times. The Apache leader seemed to sense Samuel's internal struggle. Through his daughter, he assured Samuel that he would be treated with the highest respect and that his safety would be guaranteed by the chief's personal word. He also mentioned that there was a matter of significant importance that he wished to discuss with Samuel privately, something that could benefit both their peoples. As Samuel weighed his options, he realized that refusing this invitation might actually be more dangerous than accepting it. The Apache leader was clearly a man of influence, and his goodwill could prove valuable in the volatile political climate of the territory. Moreover, Samuel's conscience told him that accepting the hospitality would show respect for the people, whose daughters he had saved. Samuel agreed to accompany them to the village with the understanding that he would be free to leave whenever he chose. The Apache leader nodded approvingly and gave orders to his men. 2 warriors rode ahead to alert the village of their approach, while the others formed a protective escort around Samuel and the 2 sisters. As they began the journey through the moonlit desert, Samuel found himself riding beside the older sister. She seemed eager to learn more about the man who had risked everything to help them, asking questions about his life on the ranch and his views on the troubled relationship between their peoples. Samuel discovered that both sisters had received education from missionary teachers and spoke English quite well, though they had initially remained silent to avoid revealing this advantage to their attackers. The older sister, whose name was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, was particularly articulate and showed a sophisticated understanding of the political complexities facing both communities. Her wounded sister, called Itzel, meaning rainbow lady, was more reserved, but displayed a quiet strength that Samuel admired. Despite her injury and the trauma of the attack, she rode without complaint and even managed to point out various landmarks and wildlife during their journey. The conversation helped pass the time as they traveled deeper into Apache territory. Samuel learned that their father, whose name was Cochise in honor of the great Apache leader, was indeed a chief, but one who favored peaceful coexistence with whites whenever possible. This explained his willingness to welcome Samuel as a guest rather than treating him with suspicion. As dawn began to break over the desert landscape, Samuel caught his first glimpse of the Apache village nestled in a protected valley between two mesas. Smoke from morning cooking fires was already rising into the clear sky, and he could see people beginning their daily activities. Soon he would learn what the chief wanted to discuss with him privately, and discover that his rescue of the two sisters was about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. The Apache village came alive with activity as word spread of the returning search party and their unusual guest. Samuel noticed how quickly news traveled through the community. Within minutes of their arrival, people had emerged from their dwellings to observe the white man who had rescued the chief's daughters. The attention made Samuel somewhat uncomfortable, but he was reassured by the respectful curiosity in most faces rather than hostility. Chief Cochise led Samuel to a special lodge reserved for honored guests, where he was invited to rest and refresh himself after the long night's journey. The accommodations were surprisingly comfortable, with well-crafted furnishings and decorative elements that spoke of a rich cultural heritage. Samuel was particularly impressed by the intricate beadwork and woven textiles that adorned the walls. Ayana brought Samuel food and water, explaining that Apache hospitality demanded guests be cared for before any serious business could be conducted. The meal consisted of venison, corn cakes, and various plants that Samuel did not recognize but found quite palatable. As he ate, Ayana shared more details about her community and their current situation. The Apache band numbered about 200 people, including warriors, elders, women, and children. They had managed to maintain their independence while many other Apache groups had been forced onto reservations, but the pressure from territorial authorities was steadily increasing. Recent incidents involving rogue settlers and aggressive military patrols had made their position increasingly precarious. Ayana explained that her father had been working tirelessly to find a peaceful solution that would allow his people to remain on their ancestral lands while avoiding conflict with the growing white population. This was an incredibly delicate balancing act that required wisdom, patience, and sometimes difficult compromises. After Samuel had eaten and rested, Chief Cochise returned with several tribal elders. The formal council meeting was conducted in both Apache and English, with Ayana serving as translator when needed. Samuel was asked to tell his story in detail, from the moment he first heard gunfire until his arrival at the village with the rescued sisters. The elders listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about Samuel's motivations and his knowledge of Apache customs. Samuel answered honestly, explaining that his actions had been driven by basic human decency rather than any political calculation. He emphasized his respect for Apache people and his desire to see peaceful relations between their communities. When the formal questioning concluded, the elders withdrew to discuss what they had heard. Samuel waited nervously, understanding that their decision about his character could have far-reaching consequences. Chief Cochise remained with him, and for the first time since their meeting, the Apache leader began to speak more personally about his situation. The chief revealed that he had been receiving increasing pressure from both territorial authorities and some members of his own tribe to make a final decision about their future. Some wanted to fight to the death to protect their homeland, while others advocated accepting reservation life as the only way to ensure their children's survival. Both options carried terrible costs that kept the chief awake at night. Samuel listened respectfully as Chief Cochise described the weight of leadership in such impossible circumstances. The Apache leader spoke with deep emotion about his love for his people and his desperate desire to find a path that would preserve their dignity while protecting their lives. It was clear that recent events had brought these pressures to a critical point. The elders returned after nearly an hour of deliberation. Their spokesperson, an ancient woman with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of generations, announced their unanimous conclusion. Samuel had acted with honor and courage, placing himself at great risk to protect innocent people who were not of his own race or tribe. This demonstrated the kind of character that deserved respect and friendship. Furthermore, the elders declared that Samuel's actions had created a debt of honor that the Apache community was obligated to repay. They would consider him a friend of their people and would offer whatever assistance they could provide should he ever need their help. This was no small commitment in a world where such alliances could mean the difference between life and death. Chief Cochise then requested a private meeting with Samuel, explaining that there was a matter of great importance that required careful discussion away from the larger group. They walked together to a quiet spot overlooking the valley, where the chief could speak freely about his most pressing concerns. The chief began by explaining that Samuel's rescue of his daughters had created an opportunity that might not come again. The incident demonstrated that cooperation between white and Apache people was possible when individuals acted with honor and respect. This could serve as a powerful example to both communities if handled correctly. However, the chief continued, there was also great danger in the current situation. Tensions were rising rapidly, and several recent incidents had pushed relations toward open warfare. Military commanders were calling for aggressive action against all Apache bands, while young warriors were demanding retaliation for attacks on their people. Chief Cochise revealed that he had been in secret communication with certain territorial officials who favored negotiation over warfare. These men understood that military campaigns against the Apache would be costly in both lives and resources, and they were willing to explore alternatives. However, they needed evidence that peaceful coexistence was truly possible. The chief proposed that Samuel could serve as an unofficial intermediary in these delicate negotiations. As a respected member of the white community who had demonstrated genuine friendship toward Apache people, Samuel was uniquely positioned to carry messages between the two sides and help build understanding. Samuel was stunned by this proposal. He had come to the village simply as a guest, expecting to spend a day or two recovering from the rescue incident before returning to his ranch. Now he was being asked to play a crucial role in potentially historic peace negotiations. The responsibility was overwhelming. The chief sensed Samuel's hesitation and assured him that no immediate answer was required. However, he pointed out that time was running short. Military preparations were already underway, and some Apache warriors were losing patience with peaceful approaches. A window of opportunity existed now that might close forever within weeks, or even days. To demonstrate his serious intentions, Chief Cochise revealed information that few white men had ever been trusted with. He described the locations of Apache camps, their defensive capabilities, and their supply situations. This intelligence could be devastatingly effective in military hands, but the chief was sharing it as proof of his commitment to finding a peaceful solution. Samuel realized that he was being offered a profound trust that carried enormous moral weight. If he accepted the chief's proposal, he would be responsible for information that could save or doom an entire people. If he refused, he might be passing up the only chance to prevent a war that would bring suffering to both sides. As evening approached, Samuel asked for time to consider the chief's proposal overnight. Chief Cochise agreed readily, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. The Apache leader arranged for Samuel to be given a private place for reflection and prayer, respecting his need for solitude during this crucial decision. That night, as Samuel lay beneath the desert stars, he thought about his dead wife and daughter and what they would want him to do. He thought about the two brave sisters he had rescued and the community that had welcomed him with such generosity. He thought about his fellow settlers and their fears and prejudices, as well as their legitimate concerns about safety and survival. By morning, Samuel knew what his answer would be, though he could not have anticipated the shocking choice that Chief Cochise was about to present to him. Samuel woke at dawn with his decision crystallized in his mind. The moral weight of the situation demanded action, and he knew he could not live with himself if he walked away from this opportunity to prevent bloodshed. He found Chief Cochise, waiting for him outside the guest lodge, the Apache leader's weathered face showing the strain of his own sleepless night. Before Samuel could speak, the chief raised his hand and gestured toward the eastern horizon, where the first rays of sunlight were painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. "Today brings both hope and sorrow," the chief said quietly in English, his voice carrying an ominous undertone that immediately put Samuel on alert. Chief Cochise explained that during the night, runners had arrived from 3 different sources, with news that would change everything. The territorial governor had issued an ultimatum demanding that all Apache bands report to designated reservations within 30 days or face military action. Simultaneously, a group of young Apache warriors from a neighboring band had attacked a supply wagon, killing 2 drivers and taking their cargo. The third piece of news was perhaps the most devastating. Samuel's own community had discovered his absence and the missing cattle, and search parties were already being organized. Some of his neighbors had jumped to the conclusion that he had been captured or killed by Apache raiders, and they were calling for immediate retaliation. Samuel felt his stomach drop as he realized how quickly the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. The window for peaceful negotiation that had seemed possible just hours earlier was closing rapidly. Both communities were now primed for conflict, and any misstep could trigger the very violence they were trying to prevent. Chief Cochise led Samuel to the center of the village, where the entire community had gathered in a great circle. The atmosphere was tense, with animated discussions taking place in small groups throughout the crowd. Samuel could sense the fear and uncertainty that permeated the gathering, even though he could not understand most of what was being said. The chief called for silence and began to address his people in Apache, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. Samuel watched the faces of the listeners as the chief spoke, seeing expressions that ranged from anger to despair to grim determination. Whatever was being discussed was clearly of vital importance to everyone present. Ayanna appeared at Samuel's side to provide translation, her own face pale with worry. She whispered that her father was explaining the 3 pieces of news they had received and presenting the limited options now available to the tribe. The debate that followed was passionate but respectful, with elders and warriors alike offering their perspectives on their increasingly desperate situation. Samuel was surprised when the chief suddenly switched to English and addressed him directly in front of the entire assembly. "Samuel Crawford, you came to us as a friend and protector of our daughters. Now fate has placed you at the center of our people's greatest crisis. What we decide today will determine whether our children live free or die fighting." The chief's words sent a murmur through the crowd as those who understood English translated for others. Samuel realized that he was no longer simply an observer, but an active participant in whatever decision was about to be made. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Chief Cochise then presented Samuel with a choice that struck him like a thunderbolt. The Apache leader offered to adopt Samuel formally into the tribe, making him a brother to his own daughters and giving him full rights and responsibilities as a member of their community. In return, Samuel would use his knowledge of white customs and language to help negotiate with territorial authorities from a position of strength. The alternative, the chief continued, was for Samuel to return immediately to his own people and serve as their spokesman in explaining the true situation to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. However, this option carried the risk that Samuel might not be believed, and that his absence from the village might be misinterpreted as evidence of Apache treachery. Samuel was stunned by the magnitude of these choices. The offer of adoption was an extraordinary honor that few white men had ever received, but accepting it would mean leaving behind his previous life entirely. Returning home carried its own risks, including the possibility that his neighbors would reject his attempts at peacemaking. As Samuel struggled with this decision, Chief Cochise revealed the most shocking aspect of his proposal. If Samuel chose to join the Apache community, he would be expected to take Ayanna as his wife, cementing the bond between himself and the chief's family. This marriage would serve both practical and symbolic purposes, demonstrating the possibility of true unity between their peoples. The proposal left Samuel speechless. He had barely had time to process his growing friendship with Ayanna, much less consider the possibility of marriage. Yet he could see the strategic wisdom in the chief's thinking. Such a union would create powerful incentives for both communities to seek peaceful solutions to their conflicts. Ayanna herself seemed unsurprised by her father's announcement, suggesting that this possibility had been discussed within the chief's family before being presented to Samuel. When Samuel looked at her questioningly, she met his gaze steadily and nodded almost imperceptibly, indicating her willingness to accept this arrangement if he chose to stay. The chief allowed Samuel several minutes to absorb the implications of these choices before explaining the timeline they were working with. Military preparations were accelerating rapidly, and the 30-day ultimatum meant that any negotiated settlement would have to be reached quickly. Every day of delay increased the likelihood that events would spiral beyond anyone's control. Samuel asked for permission to speak privately with Ayanna before making his decision. The chief granted this request, understanding that such a momentous choice required careful consideration of all its implications. The two walked together to the same overlook where Samuel had met privately with the chief the previous evening. Ayanna spoke first, explaining that she had known since childhood that her marriage would likely be arranged for political reasons rather than romantic love. However, she assured Samuel that she genuinely respected and liked him, and believed they could build a strong partnership based on mutual trust and shared commitment to peace. Samuel was touched by her honesty and maturity, but he also felt the weight of asking anyone to make such a sacrifice. He explained his concerns about the challenges they would face, not just as an interracial couple, but as symbols of cooperation during a time when both communities were moving toward conflict. Ayanna listened carefully before responding that great changes always required people willing to take great risks. She pointed out that Samuel had already demonstrated his commitment to doing what was right, rather than what was easy when he rescued her and her sister. This decision was simply another test of the same character. As they talked, Samuel found himself increasingly impressed by Ayanna's intelligence, courage, and wisdom. She understood the political complexities of their situation as clearly as any adult, yet maintained an optimism about the possibility of finding peaceful solutions. Her perspective helped Samuel see possibilities he had not previously considered. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless scout, who brought news that changed everything once again. A large military patrol had been spotted approaching the valley, apparently following the trail left by Samuel's escort from the previous night. They would arrive within hours, and their intentions were unknown, but potentially hostile. Chief Cochise made an immediate decision that demonstrated his trust in Samuel's character. Rather than treating him as a potential threat who might have led enemies to their village, the chief asked Samuel to serve as a negotiator when the military patrol arrived. This would be Samuel's first test as a bridge between the two communities. Samuel agreed without hesitation, understanding that this crisis could either validate the chief's faith in peaceful solutions or destroy any hope of avoiding warfare. As the village prepared for the arrival of the soldiers, Samuel realized that his decision about the chief's shocking proposal would have to wait. First, he had to help prevent the immediate catastrophe that was bearing down on them. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger as the military patrol approached the valley, and Samuel could feel the tension in the Apache village reaching a breaking point. Warriors had taken defensive positions while women and children were moved to protected areas, yet Chief Cochise had strictly forbidden any aggressive actions that might provoke the soldiers. Everything now depended on Samuel's ability to prevent a misunderstanding that could trigger immediate violence. Samuel positioned himself at the valley entrance alongside Chief Cochise and two tribal elders, hoping his presence would signal peaceful intentions to the approaching soldiers. He had changed into his best remaining clothes and made sure his weapons were visible but not threatening. The success of this encounter might determine whether dozens of people lived or died in the next hour. The military patrol consisted of 20 cavalry soldiers led by a young lieutenant who appeared nervous and uncertain about his mission. Samuel recognized the officer as Lieutenant Bradley Morrison, a recent graduate from West Point who had arrived in the territory only 3 months earlier. This was both good and bad news. Morrison lacked experience, but also lacked the deep prejudices that characterized some veteran Indian fighters. Lieutenant Morrison raised his hand to halt his troops about 50 yards from the Apache delegation, clearly surprised to see a white man standing beside the tribal leaders. Samuel stepped forward and identified himself, explaining that he was a guest of Chief Cochise and requesting permission to serve as interpreter for the meeting. The young officer's relief at having a white intermediary was obvious, but his military training made him suspicious of Samuel's motives. Morrison asked pointed questions about how Samuel had come to be in the Apache village and whether he was there voluntarily. Samuel answered honestly, describing the rescue of the chief's daughters and his subsequent invitation to visit the community. Chief Cochise watched this exchange carefully, understanding enough English to follow the general direction of the conversation. When Lieutenant Morrison seemed satisfied that Samuel was not being held against his will, the chief stepped forward and spoke formally in Apache, with Samuel providing translation. The chief's message was carefully crafted to demonstrate respect for military authority while defending his people's rights. He explained that his band had always sought peaceful relations with territorial authorities and had never participated in raids against white settlements. He requested information about the patrol's mission and offered full cooperation with any legitimate investigation. Lieutenant Morrison explained that he had been ordered to locate Samuel Crawford, who had been reported missing by his neighbors. The military had been asked to determine whether Samuel had been killed or captured by hostile Indians and to take appropriate action based on what they discovered. Morrison seemed genuinely relieved to find Samuel alive and unharmed. However, the lieutenant also revealed that his orders included instructions to assess the Apache village's military capabilities and defensive positions. This intelligence gathering mission put everyone in a delicate situation, since Chief Cochise could not allow detailed reconnaissance without appearing weak to his own people. Samuel found himself walking a diplomatic tightrope as he worked to satisfy both sides' legitimate concerns, while avoiding any actions that might escalate tensions. He arranged for Lieutenant Morrison to conduct a brief, formal inspection of the village that would demonstrate Apache compliance with military requests without revealing sensitive strategic information. During the inspection, Samuel was impressed by the discipline shown by both the soldiers and the Apache warriors. Despite underlying tensions and mutual suspicions, both groups maintained professional behavior and avoided provocative gestures. This suggested that peaceful coexistence might indeed be possible if leaders on both sides remained committed to avoiding conflict. The inspection also gave Samuel an opportunity to observe Lieutenant Morrison's character more closely. The young officer was clearly inexperienced, but seemed genuinely interested in finding nonviolent solutions to territorial problems. Samuel sensed an opportunity to cultivate an ally who might help facilitate future negotiations between Apache and military leaders. When the formal inspection concluded, Lieutenant Morrison requested a private conversation with Samuel. The two men walked apart from both groups, giving them freedom to speak candidly about the broader situation facing the territory. Morrison revealed that military commanders were under intense pressure from territorial politicians to take aggressive action against all Apache bands. Samuel shared his perspective on the peaceful intentions of Chief Cochise's community, emphasizing their willingness to cooperate with reasonable requests from territorial authorities. He also pointed out the strategic advantages of maintaining friendly relations with Apache groups that could serve as allies against truly hostile bands. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Lieutenant Morrison revealed that he had received intelligence about planned Apache attacks against several white settlements. The information came from sources that military commanders considered reliable, but Morrison admitted having doubts about its accuracy. This intelligence was driving the aggressive military preparations that threatened to destroy any chance for peaceful negotiations. Samuel realized immediately that this intelligence was probably false or exaggerated, designed to justify military action against Apache communities regardless of their actual behavior. He carefully explained to Morrison how such misinformation could be used to manipulate military policy for political or economic gain. The young lieutenant listened intently as Samuel described the complex web of interests that benefited from continued conflict between whites and Apaches. Territorial contractors made fortunes supplying military campaigns, while land speculators waited to claim Apache territories once the tribes were removed to reservations. Some politicians built their careers on anti-Indian rhetoric that required ongoing tensions to remain effective. Morrison's military education had not prepared him for these political realities, and Samuel could see the officer struggling to reconcile his duty to follow orders with his growing understanding of the situation's true complexity. The lieutenant admitted that some of the intelligence reports contained details that seemed suspiciously convenient for those advocating military action. Samuel seized this opportunity to propose a solution that could benefit everyone involved. He suggested that Lieutenant Morrison file a report describing Chief Cochise's band as cooperative and non-threatening, while also requesting permission to establish regular communication with the Apache community. This would allow the military to monitor the situation without resorting to immediate violence. The proposal appealed to Morrison's professional instincts, since it offered a way to gather reliable intelligence while maintaining stability in his assigned territory. However, the lieutenant pointed out that his superiors expected him to return, with evidence supporting their preconceived notions about Apache hostility. A report describing peaceful cooperation might be dismissed or might even damage Morrison's military career. Samuel understood these concerns but pressed the lieutenant to consider the broader implications of his decision. If Morrison filed false or misleading reports that contributed to an unnecessary war, he would bear moral responsibility for the deaths that followed. Military honor demanded truthful reporting, regardless of its political convenience. As their conversation continued, Samuel learned more about the specific intelligence that was driving military preparations. The reports claimed that multiple Apache bands were coordinating attacks against ranches and settlements throughout a wide area of the territory. However, Morrison admitted that attempts to verify these reports had produced conflicting and confusing information. Samuel offered to help Lieutenant Morrison investigate the accuracy of these intelligence reports by serving as an intermediary with various Apache communities. His unique position as a white man trusted by Chief Cochise's band could provide access to information that would otherwise be unavailable to military investigators. This proposal represented a significant expansion of Samuel's role beyond what Chief Cochise had originally envisioned, but Samuel realized that the crisis demanded bold action. If he could help expose false intelligence and facilitate honest communication between military and Apache leaders, he might prevent the war that seemed to be approaching inevitably. Lieutenant Morrison was clearly intrigued by this possibility, but he also understood the risks involved. If Samuel's investigation revealed evidence of genuine Apache hostility, the lieutenant would be obligated to take military action regardless of his personal preferences. If the investigation failed to produce clear results, Morrison might face criticism for delaying necessary military operations. After careful consideration, Morrison agreed to Samuel's proposal with specific conditions. The investigation would have to be completed within 2 weeks, and Samuel would be required to provide regular reports about his findings. If any evidence of hostile Apache activity was discovered, Morrison would immediately notify his superiors and take appropriate action. Samuel accepted these terms, understanding that they represented the best compromise available under the circumstances. He returned to Chief Cochise with Lieutenant Morrison's proposal, explaining how this investigation could provide an opportunity to demonstrate Apache peaceful intentions to military authorities. The chief listened carefully to Samuel's report before calling together his council of elders to discuss this unexpected development. The debate that followed was intense, with some members arguing that cooperation with military investigations was too dangerous, while others supported any effort that might prevent warfare. Chief Cochise ultimately decided to support Samuel's investigation, but with important limitations. Samuel would be allowed to visit other Apache communities and gather information about their intentions, but he could not reveal specific details about defensive preparations or strategic capabilities. The investigation would focus on demonstrating peaceful intentions rather than providing detailed intelligence. As evening approached, Lieutenant Morrison prepared to return to his base with a preliminary report describing the day's events. He promised to present Samuel's investigation proposal to his superiors and to advocate for giving diplomatic solutions a chance before resorting to military action. The departure of the military patrol left the Apache village buzzing with discussion about what these developments might mean for their future. Some people were optimistic that Samuel's investigation could help prevent war, while others remained skeptical about the possibility of changing military attitudes toward Apache people. Chief Cochise asked Samuel to meet with him privately that evening to discuss the expanded role he was being asked to play. The Apache leader wanted to ensure that Samuel fully understood the dangers he would face while traveling between different communities during such a volatile period. As they talked, the chief also returned to his shocking marriage proposal from earlier in the day. He pointed out that Samuel's new role as investigator and negotiator made the symbolic importance of such a union even greater. A marriage between Samuel and Ayana would demonstrate Apache commitment to peaceful coexistence in the most powerful way possible. Samuel found himself facing an even more complex decision than before, as his personal choices had become intertwined with the fate of entire communities. The investigation he had proposed would require weeks of dangerous travel, and there was no guarantee that it would produce the results needed to prevent warfare. That night, as Samuel contemplated the momentous decisions he would have to make, he had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would make his investigation far more perilous than anyone could have anticipated. Samuel's investigation began 3 days later when he rode out from Chief Cochise's village with 2 Apache guides who knew the locations of other bands throughout the territory. The morning air was crisp and clear, but Samuel carried with him the weight of knowing that his findings over the next 2 weeks could determine whether hundreds of people lived or died in the coming months. His first destination was a small Apache community led by an elderly chief named Nalnish, whose band had been accused in military intelligence reports of planning raids against supply wagons. The journey took 2 days through rugged terrain that tested both Samuel's horsemanship and his endurance, but his Apache guides proved to be excellent companions who shared their knowledge of the land and its dangers. When they reached Naalnish's village, Samuel was struck by how different it seemed from the militant community described in the military reports. The band consisted mainly of elders, women, and children, with only a handful of young warriors who appeared more concerned with hunting and protecting their families than with planning attacks against whites. Chief Nalnish received Samuel with cautious hospitality, understanding that this white man's visit could have significant implications for his people's future. Through careful questioning and observation, Samuel learned that this band had been struggling simply to find adequate food and shelter. They had no surplus resources or manpower for conducting raids against anyone. The supposed evidence of hostile planning turned out to be preparations for a seasonal hunting expedition that had been misinterpreted by informants who either misunderstood what they had observed or deliberately distorted the information for their own purposes. Samuel documented these findings carefully, knowing that Lieutenant Morrison would need detailed evidence to counter the false intelligence reports. Samuel's second stop was at a larger Apache community that had been accused of stockpiling weapons and ammunition for a coordinated attack against the territorial capital. This band was led by a middle-aged chief named Bidzil, whose reputation as a fierce warrior had apparently contributed to military suspicions about his intentions. However, Samuel discovered that Chief Bidzil was actually one of the strongest advocates for peaceful coexistence among all the Apache leaders. The weapons that military intelligence had identified as evidence of hostile planning were actually defensive preparations designed to protect the community against attacks by rogue outlaws and hostile settlers. Chief Bidzil explained that his people had been forced to increase their defensive capabilities after several unprovoked attacks by groups of armed whites who seemed determined to provoke Apache retaliation. The chief had deliberately avoided responding to these provocations, understanding that any violent reaction would be used to justify large-scale military action against all Apache communities. Samuel spent 3 days with Chief Bidzil's band, learning about the complex challenges they faced in trying to maintain their independence while avoiding conflict with territorial authorities. He was particularly impressed by the chief's sophisticated understanding of the political forces that were driving the territory toward warfare. The third community Samuel visited provided the most shocking revelation of his entire investigation. This band, led by a young chief named Ashki, had indeed been approached by mysterious white men who offered payment for conducting attacks against specific targets. However, Chief Ashkey had rejected these proposals and had even sent warnings to the intended victims. The young chief explained to Samuel that these mysterious recruiters had claimed to represent business interests that would benefit from increased military spending and territorial development. They had offered substantial payments in weapons and supplies for Apache attacks that could be blamed on hostile intentions rather than economic manipulation. Samuel realized that he had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy to manufacture the very war that everyone claimed to want to prevent. Certain business and political interests were actively trying to provoke Apache attacks that would justify military campaigns and territorial expansion. The intelligence reports that Lieutenant Morrison had received were not just inaccurate, they were part of a deliberate deception. Chief Ashkey provided Samuel with detailed information about these recruitment attempts, including descriptions of the men involved and the specific attacks they had requested. This evidence could potentially expose the entire conspiracy, but it also placed Samuel in extreme danger from the conspirators who would do anything to protect their scheme. Samuel's investigation was interrupted on the 10th day when one of his Apache guides brought urgent news from Chief Cochise's village. Military preparations throughout the territory had accelerated dramatically, and there were reports that a major campaign against all Apache bands would begin within days rather than weeks. More personally devastating was the news that Samuel's own ranch had been burned by unknown attackers and that his neighbors were blaming Apache raiders for the destruction. This attack had been used to justify organizing civilian militias that were demanding immediate military action against all native communities in the area. Samuel realized immediately that the attack on his ranch was almost certainly the work of the same conspirators who had been trying to recruit Apache bands for false flag operations. By destroying his property and blaming it on Apaches, they had eliminated a potential peacemaker, while creating additional justification for the war they wanted to start. The urgency of the situation forced Samuel to cut short his investigation and race back toward Chief Cochise's village with what evidence he had already gathered. However, his Apache guides warned him that the direct route back to the village was now being patrolled by hostile militia groups who might attack any Apache they encountered. Samuel was faced with a terrible choice. He could try to reach Lieutenant Morrison directly with his evidence, hoping to prevent the military campaign before it began. Alternatively, he could return to Chief Cochise's village to help prepare the Apache community for the attack that now seemed inevitable. The decision was made for him when his guide spotted smoke rising from the direction of Chief Cochise's village. The military campaign had apparently already begun, and Samuel's investigation had come too late to prevent the very war he had been trying to stop. Racing toward the smoke with his heart pounding, Samuel discovered that the village was indeed under attack, but not by regular military forces. A large group of civilian militias, apparently acting without official authorization, had launched a surprise assault that had caught the Apache community unprepared for immediate warfare. Samuel arrived at the battle just as Chief Cochise was, organizing his warriors for a desperate defense of their homes and families. The sight of Samuel returning at this critical moment brought hope to Apache fighters who had feared their white friend had abandoned them in their hour of greatest need. Without hesitation, Samuel joined the defense of the village, using his knowledge of military tactics to help Chief Cochise coordinate an effective resistance against the militia attack. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with both sides fighting desperately for survival and principle. In the midst of the fighting, Samuel caught sight of Ayanna helping to evacuate wounded Apache defenders to safety. The courage and determination she displayed under fire made Samuel realize that his feelings for her had grown far beyond mere respect and friendship. If they survived this battle, he knew exactly what his answer to Chief Cochise's marriage proposal would be. The fighting continued through the day and into the night, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. However, Samuel knew that Apache ammunition and supplies were limited, while the militia forces might receive reinforcements at any time. Something had to change quickly if the Apache community was going to survive. As dawn approached, Samuel made a desperate decision that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of everyone in the village he had come to consider his true home.